well-traveled, highly educated academic.
Investment banker.
Investment banker. We'll censor that. We'll bleep that out. Why have you fallen so deeply in love with rock and roll? And it can be as poetic or
It's not just rock and roll. I mean,
the
you know,
music and art scene.
my main focus now is the chamber orchestra. I hate to call it classical music because that's such a terrible name, but written music, formal music, whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
I just have always loved music. I mean, in New York, it was the same thing. I had a club. I sponsored a record label, and I just really love music. For me, that's the most important thing there is. And since I'm smart enough to know that I'm not a musician, then I can be the next best thing, which is to, you know, support musicians, to
No James Dolan.
create. You know, I wish I could get on stage and do what Shoang does, but but I'm smart enough to know that I'm not a musician.
And when we're dealing with sort of this increasing, what would be the word, technicalization of the world, where things are put in values, things are put into metrics or algorithms, or this sense of that you don't learn Chinese just to learn Chinese. You learn Chinese to have a skill. You don't travel just for the sake of traveling. You travel to gain life experience that can help
Right.
sort of your social class best be demonstrated, and that you're a cultured person. Or you use it for your college CV or your CV for your first investment banking job.
Right.
What are some of the lessons we can take from, or what are some ways we can perhaps push back on that notion, or should it be pushed back on? Should we be moving towards this sort of future where everything has to have a purpose, everything has to have a reason?
Well, that's where it's really good to read a lot of history, and I'm sort of a history junkie, and that is that there's nothing really new about that. This is a criticism we've been making for a long time. In fact, it's a permanent criticism of modernity, and I don't worry too much about it. There's always going to be people who are really interested in the arts, who are really going to support the arts. The definition of the arts may change. We don't have a lot of poets anymore, but that's fine. There's always interesting stuff being done, and there are always people who are going to take it very seriously. Those kind of things, I guess, you know, I hate to pull rank, but as you get older, I think you worry less about some of those things. And for me, the key thing is whether there's really interesting, particularly music, but there's really interesting art being made in Beijing, particularly music, because that's what interests me the most, and that's where I can play the biggest role. And as long as you have all of these kids that are just really, really excited about, you know, playing with the arts, and we can give them something to play with, and more importantly, we can let them know that, you know, that they have an audience. You don't need an audience of millions. You know, sometimes you just need 5 or 10 people to take you seriously, to know that what you're doing makes sense and to keep on doing it.
Yeah.
So as long as, you know, I think as long as these young people can get into this and know that they're going to get respect and get taken seriously for it, then we're always going to see good stuff being produced. I'm not really worried about that.
And is it fair to say, not to diminish the contributions of maybe Mars, but in the more romantic sense, that if you weren't here, this would still be happening? If we couldn't find the club, we'd play in the subway overpass.
Well, I think now, if I were to leave, it would continue going.
Yeah.
I think if you look at the history of movements have tended to be very localized. And in fact, one of my professors at Columbia told me that the history of art, we always treat it as the history of artists, but it should be more the history of the patrons of the art, because they create the platform and the sort of the center of attention. And I don't want to put myself in that role. A lot of people say that in China, and I think I did play an important role for a brief period by opening the club. But once all of these musicians started to congregate and they became self-conscious of themselves as musicians and as an interesting scene, were just as good as people abroad. I think by then, you know, Beijing's a big city, and something was going to happen. One way or the other, something was going to happen.
This is a very specific question. I only have a few more, if that's all right, Michael.
Sure, whatever you like.
I have long been fascinated with the tension that comes within a patriarchal, or what is it, 重男轻女society, where historically men have been favored over women, that for whatever reason, some of my favorite bands have always been female bands or female fronted. People like Nova Heart, Queen C, Big Shark, The Hormones, Hung in the Box. I'm wondering.
And the best of them all are So Besides Me, which was three girls, but the real leader of the band was Young Fan.
Is there a sense of women using music as a way to sort of express some of the tensions of society, or a sense of, in a society where your identity is to sort of be perhaps quiet or suppressed or secondary to men, that a woman could get on the stage, shred guitar like a motherfucker, scream her heart and soul out, and really find a new identity that way? Is maybe some of the tension of society contributing to all these great female bands?
It's weird because women play a very important role in the scene. If I were to list for me, the most important people in the scene, I would say Yang Ai-song, Shou Wang, Yan Yulong, all of them guys, Yang Fan and Li Qing, both girls. So they play a very important role in the scene. And it's strange because China is, I probably shouldn't say this in public because officially it's not true, but China is an incredibly sexist country. And yet, in a weird way, among the sort of upper middle class, highly educated kids, you don't notice so much sexual differences. I mean, the boys and girls don't create really big, role differences between them. Their parents do, and of course, if you're not married as a girl by the time you're 30, you're pretty much finished, you're used up. They even have a word for it. And that doesn't happen with guys. But I see among my students and in the music scene, I don't see that kind of automatic, discrimination take place. It takes place to a small extent, but not nearly as much as you would have thought, and certainly not nearly as much as it does in the outside community. Women are taken pretty seriously in the music scene here, and they play really important roles, and not just support roles. But as I said, I think Yang Fan, I think all of us think Yang Fan might be a genius of some sort. Very difficult one, I always insist, but she just does amazing work, and she's taken totally seriously by her male counterparts. And yeah, there are, males still dominate, particularly on the punkier side. But there are a lot of women in the music scene. And then in the avant-garde scene, the experimental scene, there's also, I would say. One of the things they keep telling me is we're not really that interested in politics. We don't really care. And different artists are interested in different things. I mean, you listen to the Velvet Underground, and they never spoke about politics. They spoke about things that were extremely interesting to them. And I think for a lot of these young musicians, just the change they're going through, the difficulties they have with their parents, the huge uncertainty. One of the things that really shocks me and depresses me a bit about the Chinese kids, including the ones that I teach, who are the elite, once you get into Peking University, your life is resolved, is their fear of the future, their uncertainty, almost the desperation about what the future holds. And I think those are the things that they're interested in talking about. And those are the things that are most important to them. And so that's what they talk about. That's what they deal with in their art.
And what are some of those conversational threads?
You know, things like I'm almost anything I do, I'm going to disappoint my parents. That's a real, it's something that I hear all the time. This disappointing my parents, disappointing my parents. And some of these people, you know, like Shouang is 32 years old. He's a star. I mean, you know, he's interviewed all the time in the Chinese press and the foreign press. He goes to New York. You know, sometimes I've been in New York with him. I don't even see him. He just disappears. He gets to go to all of these really cool things that, you know, you have to be, you know how snobby New York is in the art scene. He's a big name, big star in his area, and yet he still dreads the holidays because of the family dinners, because he's just such a big disappointment. And you know, I maybe that was what it was like in the U.S. in the 60s. I don't really know, although it seems to me that being young in the 60s was really fantastic in the U.S. Maybe not, who knows. But I think those are the things that they're really trying to deal with. And there's, for some reason, a huge sense of uncertainty. You'd think a country that's growing so quickly, you wouldn't be worried about your career, about your jobs. And yet, again, maybe it's the people that I speak to who tend to be the elite students who tend to have enormous pressure placed on them. But they're very worried about their futures, about their future careers, about their jobs, the whole thing. And maybe that just reflects the fact that things have changed so dramatically socially in China that you don't have all of your comforting, you know, sort of signposts around you. But the point is that those are the things that the young artists seem to find interesting, and so those are the things that they really talk about. They're not that interested in talking about politics. You know, there's this assumption that if they don't talk about politics, it's because they're afraid. And of course, you know, they're not stupid. They know they're not supposed to talk about politics. But a lot of them just aren't that interested in it.
Mm-hmm. And building on that is sort of another paradoxical question. Sorry for using a word that I think dumb people use a lot incorrectly or to sound smart. Hopefully that's not the case here. So for a lot of Western artists and people who are snobby about China in the negative way, oh, you know, you don't have freedom of expression. Oh, the art can't be interesting there because of these issues of censorship. Did you see from your past history of working in New York and from having to deal with foreign media and people asking you these same sorts of questions, that there's a blind spot for a lot of Western criticism where just because I can say fuck Trump and a Chinese person can't doesn't mean anything is going to happen.
Right.
And whereas for me saying fuck Trump gives me catharsis, but nothing changes, for a Chinese musician or artist, they know they can't say that, but they also know it won't mean anything, so they have to explore perhaps much more meaningful avenues of change. I'm wondering if
maybe, but I see again. That's why I say I don't know if they're particularly interested in that. I don't think, you know, and I'm just guessing because I'm not an insider here. But
Sure.
Growing up as a young Chinese, I don't think the big question that you have is how do I affect change. I think the question you have is how do I deal with all of this change. So you know, they may have a really different set of questions. As for foreign snobbery, there are people who say things like that. For example, the panel that I was on in the BBC program. But one of the things that really strikes me, at least among artists, is that if anything, there's a reverse snobbery. In other words, there is a real interest in what the Chinese are doing that I think has been very, very helpful. That's why when we start the chamber orchestra, I'm pretty sure that in a few years, our young composers are going to be reasonably well known, because I'm pretty sure that as soon as we start performing music written by young Chinese composers, everyone in the world is going to be asking us, you know, what's going on? Can we hear it? I'm not worried that we won't get a chance to, you know, get people to hear what we're doing, because people have been really interested. If I were, for example, in Thailand, I think it would be much harder to get people, you know, to get anybody interested. But there's a real openness to checking out what the Chinese artists are doing. At least in the music scene, I found that. And you know, you should ask the musicians about their tours abroad. They're really happy with their tours abroad because you know, people have treated them very well. Their artists have come out, their heroes have come out to check them out. And maybe it's because, you know, the role China plays in the world is just so big, and it's just been totally non-existent for the last 100 years that everyone's really curious. But there is a lot of curiosity, and and we want to exploit that. We want to be able to get our musicians listened to, and we think they will be. Now, there are people who are going to give all the nonsense. China isn't producing any culture, etc. But those are really not people involved in culture. Those are really outsiders. So I guess Chinese artists are not necessarily trying to figure out how to change things. Things have changed so much that it could be that they're just trying to figure out how to deal with the existing change.
Sure.
And maybe in 20 years, these kind of questions will be more meaningful. But I don't really get this. The sense that I get is the sense of wonderment. It's like all of this stuff is happening. I have no idea what's going on. What do I do? You had heard about all of these artists, but you'd never heard their music. Right. And you just had this enormous curiosity. What is all this stuff I've been hearing about? And then suddenly you get the entire last 100 years of Western music handed to you on a plate. Imagine, how you would react to that. Yeah, exactly. I mean, through the internet, you could hear anything. And so how do you deal with that? It's very exciting, but it's also very confusing because you have no way of framing anything. You have no context for anything.
What if you were going to have to create a diplomat's briefcase? So you can only bring a few CDs.
You can't ask a music lover that, because even if I could bring 10, yes, I know, but there's all this great shit I forgot to mention.
Is there any music in particular you would say is exciting right now, and then maybe for people who are trying to get a bit more?
I'm always turning my favorite musicians onto particularly American jazz, and I have a real weakness for the bebop and the post-bop stuff, but all of that period. I just think that's the greatest music of the 20th century, so I love that stuff. I love, for me, when you say Velvet Underground, then there's a whole constellation of music that sort of comes out of that, the whole New York scene, and I love all of that stuff. Sonic Youth first started out in my club in New York, and I love Sonic Youth, and a lot of it is the kind of stuff that you would, I don't know. Having grown up in Spain, I love flamenco, so I'm always turning them on to flamenco, although they find it really bizarre and weird. But there's just so much great music out there, and John Adams and Steve Reich, I play a lot for these guys, and I try to get them to listen more to late 19th and early 20th century classical music, which seems to be a bit of a blind spot. But it's not, I love the stuff, but the reason I try to turn them onto it is because I don't think they're listening to it, and they should be. But they're pretty, it's amazing. You talk to some of these guys, and they were, what was the name of the band? It turns out it's this really influential experimental New York band from the late 60s, early 70s. They actually wanted to bring them, and I paid for the trip to come here. I hadn't even heard of them. And it was Ju Wembo who said, "Oh no, but they're really famous. You have to listen to them. This is, they know stuff about the New York scene that I didn't even know."
Mm-hmm. And for, if it's possible, would you be able to give a couple recommendations for people who watch this interview for Chinese music? If it's a foreigner, they're about to study abroad, they want to do a deep dive into the culture. What are some songs or sounds that you've really loved over the years?
Well, the anthem of the scene is a song called Jungnan Hai by Karsik Cars. Jungnan Hai is a brand of cigarettes quite popular in Beijing. and it's also the leadership compound. It was the cigarettes that Chairman Mao smoked. And when they perform the song, the audience just goes absolutely nuts, and they pelt the band with cigarettes. There are times when, it's 2 inches thick of cigarettes on the stage. It really is crazy. So that, it's a great song, and it's got this amazing sort of a twisted guitar solo in the middle. And that, I love it, but historically you have to listen to it. And just generally, Cars Cigars was an extremely important band. PK-14 was, as I said, that was the band that really taught Chinese artists that rock and roll can be a medium for Chinese artists. And so a lot of music comes out of them. I would say anything that Shouwang or Yan Yulong does, whether it's their bands, Yan Yulong's band is a Chuiwan, or whether it's composed stuff that they do. I think Ourself Besides Me put out only one record, much to my dismay. I think it is one of the greatest records of the century, just an amazing record. There's just so much. Bird Striking has done really great stuff. I could go on and on. I think we have something like 75 releases. And the rule for us is that we will not support a band that we aren't in love with and that we aren't incredibly proud that they're on our label. Yeah. And so that means basically we haven't put out a record that I don't like.
Yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity, but what I would probably do is just reinforce what I said earlier, and that is that in fact, it's a bigger problem with those of us who are most well-meaning, and that is we shouldn't bring our attitudes about what is good about Chinese music to Chinese music. We should listen to it first. Because, you get these really very, very nice people, and they don't realize how patronizing they are, but they've come to China to defend Chinese music. And the truth is, Chinese music doesn't need to be defended. There's such great stuff happening. Just listen to it, and don't make any assumptions about it. It's not going to be whatever you think it is. You would have to be a genius to be able to figure out what it's going to be, because none of us really know. We've never seen what's happened in China. We've never seen that happen before in history. So all we know is that if the young people have any brains at all, they're going to respond to it in some really interesting new way, and that's going to be Chinese culture.
Yeah. One last P.S.
Sure.
We had talked about this generational divide. Are we winning over any grandparents or grandmothers or any parents? Are we seeing
Probably
any
not.
middle-aged people coming into the clubs? Or?
Well, you see the kind of people that you would expect to see, people who are artists or very heavily involved in the art scene. And then from time to time you'll see the band's parents show up. Yeah. And they're very politely, a little bit bewildered, afraid to talk to anybody. They have no idea what their kids are doing. They're very proud that everybody's applauding their kids, but they have no idea what's going on. No, it's not very easy.
It's still hard.
But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be because, remember, their parents really grew up in a completely different China, under completely different circumstances. Yeah.
Well, Mike, thanks so much.
Thank you.